The wind came first. It screamed across the empty plains of Wyoming like a ghost wandering the high country. The sound rolled down from the distant Wind River Mountains and cut through the frozen land like a knife. Winter had arrived early, and it had arrived angry. Snow followed behind the wind, not soft flakes, but sharp pellets that stung the skin and blurred the sky with the ground. In the 1880s, Wyoming Territory was not a place for weak souls. The mountains stood in the distance like dark giants watching the land with cold, ancient eyes. Beneath the broken skeleton of an old wagon on an abandoned mining trail, a woman lay half buried in frozen mud. Her name, for now, was Clara. She looked more like a bundle of discarded cloth than a living person. Her body was curled tight against the bitter wind as she clutched a torn shawl around her shoulders. The thin dress beneath it had been ripped in several places, and the cold air sliced through the cloth like it was nothing. Her face was pale and hollow. A dark bruise spread across her jaw, deep purple like spoiled fruit. Her hair was tangled and dirty, sticking to her skin with sweat and frost. Her feet were bare, cracked and bleeding from days of running across rocks and frozen ground. She had been running for 3 days, maybe 4. Time had stopped meaning anything. Her body trembled violently, not just from the cold, but from fever burning deep inside her bones. The wind found her anyway. It pushed through the wagon wreckage and tore at her thin clothes until the last bit of warmth fled her body. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes closed. The world faded into black. Far down the trail, a man walked through the storm. His name was Wes. The wind howled around him, but he barely noticed it. He was built for this brutal country. Tall as a pine tree and broad through the shoulders, he moved slowly but steadily through the snow. Behind him, a mule followed, loaded with 2 freshly hunted deer tied across the saddle. Steam rose from the animals in the cold air. Wes's face looked like a map of old troubles. A long silver scar ran from the corner of his eye down across his cheek to his jaw. The mark pulled his skin tight, giving his face a permanent hard expression. That scar had come from a knife long ago, in a life he had left behind. He stopped when he saw the wagon. His hand rested slowly on the rifle strapped beside his saddle. Strangers in the mountains rarely meant anything good. He circled the broken wagon carefully, scanning the snow for tracks. The storm had already begun wiping most of them away, but he spotted faint prints nearby. Barefoot tracks. Small ones. They staggered through the snow before disappearing under the wagon. Then he saw her. For a long moment, Wes said nothing. He simply stood there while snow gathered on his hat and coat. His mule snorted behind him, impatient. His first instinct was to walk away. A woman like this meant trouble. Bruised, half dead, abandoned on a mining trail. Somewhere out there, men would be looking for her. Men with guns. Men who asked questions. Questions could lead to the law. And the law was something Wes had been hiding from for 8 long years. He cursed quietly under his breath. Then he crouched down beside the wagon. His big hand reached under the axle and touched the woman's shoulder. Her body was light, frighteningly light, as if she were made only of bones and cold air. He pulled her gently from beneath the wagon. She did not wake. Her breathing was shallow, barely there. Fever burned through her skin. Wes looked at her face, at the bruises, at the delicate wrists that looked far too fragile for the cruel life she had clearly lived. He let out a slow breath that turned to white fog in the cold. Then he lifted her easily and laid her across the mule behind the deer. He turned toward the cliffs where the pine trees grew thick and dark. Hidden there, deep in the rocks, stood the small cabin he had built with his own hands, the only place in the world that had tolerated him. The cabin sat between two cliffs where the wind could not reach easily. Tall lodgepole pines surrounded it, hiding it from the main trail. It was small. One room, a stone fireplace, a rough table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot. Pelts and hides stacked in the corner. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine, leather, and goat. It was not much, but it kept the world away. Wes carried her inside and laid her carefully on his cot. For a moment he simply stood there. A woman in his cabin felt strange. Wrong somehow. Like a storm had entered the room. He built the fire higher until the flames roared in the hearth. Soon, warmth pushed back the cold that had followed them inside. Then he boiled water. Her dress was frozen stiff with mud and blood. He cut it away carefully with his skinning knife, making sure the blade never touched her skin. He did not stare, but he saw the bruises, across her ribs, across her back. Old ones and new ones mixed together like a cruel map. And on her shoulder, he saw something worse. A small brand burned into her skin, a miner's pick, and a letter. His jaw tightened. He washed the dirt from her body with warm water and wrapped her feet in clean bandages after pouring whiskey over the deep cuts. She flinched even in unconsciousness. Then he dressed her in one of his long wool shirts and covered her with the thickest bearskin he owned. Hours passed. The fire crackled. Wes sat across the room in a chair, watching her breathe. He had just brought trouble into his home. Clara woke with a silent scream trapped in her throat. Warmth hit her first. That terrified her. Warm rooms meant men. Her eyes flew open. She sat upright, pulling the bearskin tight around her body. Panic filled her chest as she looked around the dim cabin. Low wooden beams, rifles mounted on the wall, a fireplace. Then she saw him. The giant man sitting near the fire. He was sharpening a knife slowly against a whetstone. The soft scraping sound filled the room. He did not look at her. "Where am I?" she croaked. His voice came low and rough. "My cabin." He wiped the blade on his pant leg and finally looked up. His eyes were pale gray, like winter ice. "You're safe from the storm." "Safe?" The word felt like a lie. She tried to move away, but pain exploded through her feet. She gasped and pulled the wool shirt tighter around herself. "Don't touch me," she rasped. Wes didn't move from his chair. Wasn't planning to. He stood slowly, towering over the small room. Clara shrank back as fear raced through her chest. He walked to the fire, picked up a tin cup of broth, and set it halfway between them on the floor. "Drink that," he said. He nudged it closer with his boot. "You're weak." Then he returned to his chair and sat down again, staring into the fire. Clara stared at the cup. It could be poisoned. It could be a trap. But the smell of meat and salt made her stomach twist violently with hunger. The man did not look at her. He did not speak. He just sat there, holding the knife and watching the flames. Slowly, with shaking hands, Clara reached for the cup. She drank. The hot broth burned her throat and filled her empty stomach with warmth so powerful it made her cry out softly. But she didn't stop. She drank every drop. Across the room, the giant man said nothing. And in that silent mountain cabin, the strangest truce had just begun. Clara expected the giant man to demand something after that first night. Every man she had ever known eventually did. But Wes did not. He simply fed her. Morning, noon, and night, he placed a bowl of broth or thin stew on the floor between them, then stepped away. Sometimes he sat by the fire carving wood or mending traps. Sometimes he cleaned his rifle. Sometimes he simply stared at the flames, as if the fire held secrets he was trying to understand. Days passed. Clara slowly regained strength. The fever left her body, and the deep shaking stopped. Her feet began to heal beneath the bandages Wes changed every few days. His hands were rough and steady. He never lingered. He never touched her more than necessary. He treated her like a wounded animal. And strangely, that made her more uneasy than if he had been cruel. Men she understood. Men who shouted, grabbed, laughed too loudly, and demanded things were predictable. But Wes was silent. His quietness felt like a wall she could not see past. The dreams came every night. She was back in the gold dust mining camp. The smell of cheap whiskey filled the long canvas tent that served as a saloon. Sawdust covered the floor to soak up spilled drinks and blood. Men crowded around her. Their hands grabbed. Their voices laughed. Clara had once arrived there, believing she would be a dancer on a proper stage. Instead, she became entertainment for miners who had spent weeks digging in mud and stone. She learned to smile. She learned to pour drinks. She learned to survive. Then Rickard arrived. Rickard was not a miner. He followed mining camps the way vultures followed cattle drives. He traded whiskey, supplies, and women. When Clara's debts to the camp owner grew too large, Rickard paid them with a handful of gold coins. That night he leaned close to her ear. "You belong to me now," he whispered. The next day, the brand burned into her shoulder. Clara always woke from that memory shaking. One night, she woke suddenly in the dark cabin. The fire had burned low. The room glowed red with fading embers. Wes sat asleep in his chair near the wall. His head leaned back, his eyes closed, but even in sleep, his huge hands rested in loose fists on his knees. Clara watched him carefully. For the first time, she noticed the scars on his knuckles. This man had fought before. He was not just a quiet mountain hermit. He carried something heavy inside him. Days passed. Clara grew restless. The cabin that once felt like a refuge began to feel like a suoitaha. Wes moved through the small space like a silent shadow, working on his traps, mending tools, feeding the goats outside. One evening, she finally spoke. "You ever get lonely up here?" Wes did not look up from the snowshoe he was repairing. "No. Most men would. I ain't most men." She stared at him, frustration rising. "I can see that." Her voice sharpened. "Most men don't hide in a hole in the mountains like a badger." His hand stopped. Slowly he looked up at her. The coldness in his eyes made her flinch. "You should rest," he said. "I'm tired of resting." She stood, anger boiling through her. "I'm tired of you watching me like I'm some sick animal." The wool shirt hung loosely around her thin body as she stepped closer. "Why did you bring me here?" she demanded. "What do you want?" Wes stood. The small cabin seemed to shrink as his full height filled the room. He was nearly a foot taller than her, wide and solid as a tree trunk. "I wanted," he said slowly, "to not let you freeze to death." "People don't do things for nothing," Clara snapped. "Not where I come from." Her voice trembled with old bitterness. "Are you waiting for me to get stronger? Is that it?" The words came out like knives. "You want me to entertain you as payment?" Wes took one slow step toward her. Clara held her ground, even though her heart pounded in fear. She knew how to survive men like that. Better to provoke them than wait. "What's wrong, cowboy?" she challenged. "Afraid to take what you want?" Wes stared at her for a long moment. His scarred face gave away nothing. Then he turned away and grabbed his heavy coat from the wall. "Where are you going?" she demanded. "To check the goats. It's the middle of the night." "You're a coward," she whispered. Wes paused at the door. "No," he said quietly. "I'm just a man who knows his own strength." He stepped outside into the snow and closed the door behind him. Clara stood alone in the cabin. His words echoed in her mind. A man who knows his own strength. Hours later, she began exploring the room. She found his books stacked in a crate beside the bed. A Bible rested on top. Beneath it lay a worn leather journal. Curiosity won. She opened it. Inside were drawings. Beautiful drawings. A hawk perched on a branch. Every feather detailed with careful charcoal strokes. A pine cone drawn so perfectly it looked real. A mountain peak sketched exactly as it appeared outside the cabin window. Between the drawings were simple lines of writing. "The wind is strong tonight. Saw wolf tracks near the ridge. Silence is a good neighbor. It asks for nothing." Clara turned the pages slowly. This was not the work of a brute. This was a man who watched the world closely. A man who saw things. She was still reading when the door opened. Wes stepped inside. Snow fell from his coat as he removed his gloves. His eyes moved immediately to the book in her hands. Clara froze. She expected shouting. She expected anger. Instead, Wes simply looked tired. Deeply tired. She closed the journal and held it out. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He took it and placed it carefully back in the crate. "The pass is buried," he said quietly. "Nothing's getting in or out for a while." That was how winter trapped them together. Snow buried the cabin in drifts taller than the windows. Every morning, Wes had to dig a trench just to open the door. The outside world disappeared. Inside the small cabin, a strange routine formed. Wes began teaching her how to live in the mountains. "You'll need to learn the wood," he said one morning, handing her a pair of worn wool gloves. "I can't haul for two." Clara followed him outside. He showed her how to split firewood. At first, the axe felt impossibly heavy in her hands. Her first swing missed completely. Her second barely dented the log. Frustration burned behind her eyes. "I can't," she muttered. "Yes, you can," Wes said calmly. "You just ain't done it yet." She hated that he refused to pity her. She swung again. This time the axe struck harder. The log cracked open. Clara stared at the clean split wood in shock. It was the first useful thing she had done in a long time. Slowly, life inside the cabin began to change. Clara swept the floor with a broom made from pine branches. She washed the table with lye soap until the wood shone clean. She mended torn blankets with careful stitches. The cabin began to feel different. Warmer. More alive. One afternoon, Wes returned from checking traps and stopped in the doorway. The room smelled of pine and clean soap. Clara sat by the fire, sewing a patch onto his shirt. For a brief moment, she looked like something he had never imagined seeing in his cabin. A wife. The thought startled him so badly he turned away quickly and began feeding logs into the fire. The uneasy truce between them lasted for weeks, until the day the stovepipe nearly set the cabin on fire. Wes climbed onto the roof to fix it, while Clara held the pipe steady from inside. Suddenly, a glowing ember dropped from the joint. It landed on her shoulder. The wool shirt began to burn. "Wes!" she shouted. The door burst open. He crossed the room in 3 long strides. Without hesitation, he grabbed the burning cloth and tore the shirt open, ripping the fire away from her skin. The wool fell to the floor, and he stomped it out. The cabin fell silent. Clara stood frozen. The cold air hit her bare skin, where the shirt hung torn open across her chest. Wes looked up and saw the marks covering her body, bruises, scars, and the brand burned into her shoulder. She waited for him to react like every other man. But Wes only looked at her with something else in his eyes. Not hunger, not anger, just pain. He dropped the ruined shirt and walked to his bunk. A moment later, he returned with a clean one and held it out. "Here." Clara took it with shaking hands. He turned away while she dressed. "The stove's fixed," he said quietly. Then he stepped back outside into the storm. That night, the silence between them felt heavier than ever. Finally, Clara spoke. "Why?" Wes looked up from his rifle. "Why what? Why did you turn away?" He studied the fire for a long time before answering. "What did you want me to do?" She didn't know. Shout. Demand something. Anything that made sense. Instead, he whispered something she never expected to hear. "I'm afraid." "Afraid of what?" Wes ran a tired hand across his scarred face. "Of you," he said quietly. "And of myself." The words hung in the air like smoke. Clara stared at him. For the first time, she realized something shocking. This giant mountain of a man was not dangerous because he wanted to hurt her. He was dangerous because he was terrified he might. "Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know." Winter tightened its grip around the cabin after that night. The snow grew deeper, and the sky turned the pale color of iron. Days passed in a quiet rhythm of work and small words. Yet something had changed between them. The wall that once stood between Clara and Wes had cracked. They were still careful around each other, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt alive. Clara noticed the difference first in the small moments. When Wes handed her a cup of coffee in the morning, their fingers brushed. Neither of them pulled away anymore. When she struggled with a knot in a trap line, his hands covered hers for a moment longer than necessary. They were both aware of it. Neither spoke about it. The blizzard arrived one night without warning. The wind screamed across the mountains and buried the cabin under walls of snow. For 5 days, the outside world vanished. The door could not be opened, and the windows froze into sheets of white ice. There were no chores left to do, no traps to check, no wood to gather, only the fire and each other. On the third night, the quiet grew unbearable. Clara sat close to Wes as he sketched in his journal. His big hand moved slowly across the page, while charcoal scratched softly against the paper. "What are you drawing?" she asked. Wes hesitated. Then he turned the book slightly. It was her hand. Her small hand, holding a sewing needle while she mended a blanket. Clara stared at the drawing. "You see things," she whispered. Wes closed the journal slowly. The air between them felt charged with something new. Something dangerous. Something neither of them could pretend not to feel anymore. On the 5th night, the storm finally died. Silence filled the cabin. Clara stood from the floor and walked toward him. He watched her carefully. "June," he warned softly. She shook her head. "Don't say my name like it's a sin." She knelt in front of him and placed her hands on his knees. "You're still afraid," she said. "I told you," he answered quietly. "I break things." Clara leaned closer until her face was only inches from his. "I'm not glass, Wes," she whispered. "I've been through fire already." Then she kissed him. For a moment he did nothing. He sat frozen like a mountain under snowfall. Then something inside him broke loose. His hands rose and cupped her face gently. The kiss deepened slowly, filled with years of loneliness neither of them had spoken aloud. It was not hunger. It was relief. When he pulled away, his breathing was uneven. "We shouldn't," he said. "We must," Clara answered. He lifted her easily and carried her to the cot. That night their touch was careful and uncertain, like two wounded people learning how to trust again. Wes moved slowly, terrified of hurting her. Clara guided him, her quiet confidence calming the storm inside him. For the first time in her life, she chose it. For the first time in his life, he did not feel like a monster. Morning came with sunlight reflecting across endless snow, but peace did not last long. A week later, Wes climbed the ridge to check his traps. That was when he saw the tracks. A horse, one rider. The man had stopped on the ridge and watched the cabin for a long time before riding away toward the pass. Wes knew what that meant. The world had found them. When he returned to the cabin, Clara saw the change in him immediately. His movements were sharper. His eyes watched the woods constantly. That night he slept with a knife in his hand. "Who are you waiting for?" Clara asked the next morning. Wes stared at the floor. "A rider came through," he said quietly. "Someone's looking." The words filled the room with dread. Days later the rider returned, but he did not come alone. 3 horses approached the cabin through melting snow. Clara looked through the window. The moment she saw the man in front, her blood turned cold. "That's him," she whispered. "Rickard." Wes's jaw tightened. Rickard rode forward with 2 bounty hunters beside him. He smiled when he saw Wes standing on the porch. "I'm looking for a girl," Rickard called out smoothly. "Red hair, answers to the name Clara." Wes did not move. "There's no one here by that name." Rickard laughed. "Come out, Clara," he shouted toward the cabin. "You still belong to me." Inside the cabin, Clara's hands shook. She grabbed the iron shovel beside the hearth and filled it with glowing embers. Outside, one of the bounty hunters climbed off his horse and cracked a whip. Wes stepped down into the snow. The whip snapped toward his face. Wes caught it in midair. Then he pulled. The man stumbled forward. Wes's fist struck once. The bounty hunter collapsed into the snow. Rickard reacted instantly. He pulled a revolver and aimed it toward the cabin door. Clara burst outside. With a scream of fury, she threw the burning embers straight into Rickard's face. The horse reared violently. Rickard fell into the snow, screaming. The second bounty hunter panicked and fled down the trail. Wes grabbed Rickard and slammed him against the cabin wall. His arm pressed against the man's throat. Rage flooded through him like wildfire. He was seconds away from killing him. "Wes!" Clara's voice stopped him. Her hands grabbed his arm. "Don't become him," she begged. The rage inside him trembled. Slowly, Wes stepped back. Instead of killing Rickard, he forced him to sign a written confession admitting everything he had done to June. Then he sent him walking back through the mountains without a horse. The fight was over, but the damage remained. That evening, Clara packed her small bundle of belongings. She believed she had awakened the violence Wes tried so hard to bury. Quietly, she stepped out of the cabin and began walking into the forest. Wes felt it instantly. He ran after her through the snow. "June!" he shouted. She turned as he reached her. "I have to go," she whispered. "I'm the darkness you tried to escape." Wes reached into his pocket and held out something small. It was the birch carving she had made. The letters, W and J. "I found this," he said quietly. "It's the only real thing I've had in 8 years." His voice broke. "If you leave, I go back to the empty silence." Clara collapsed into his arms. They held each other in the cold mountain dusk. Then Wes whispered the words that would bind their lives together forever. "You're mine," he said. "Not as property. As home." Spring came slowly after that. They planted crops and rebuilt the barn together. When they finally rode to the nearby town to trade pelts, people stared at them with curiosity and judgment. But Wes never let go of her hand. Eventually, the preacher from town arrived at their cabin with a land registry book. To claim the land legally, the law required a married couple. So, one warm summer morning, they stood beside the mountain stream. June wore a simple wool dress and blue wildflowers in her hair. Wes stood beside her, freshly shaved, the scar on his face bright in the sunlight. They had no rings. When the preacher finished the ceremony, Wes simply took her hand. "You are one," the preacher said. And for the first time in their lives, the world recognized what they had built together. Years passed. The cabin grew larger. The barn became strong and full of animals. Children's laughter echoed through the valley. One evening, long after the sun had begun to set behind the Wind River Mountains, Wes stood on the porch with his arms wrapped around June. His hair was gray now. Her red hair carried threads of silver. Their children played near the stream. The scars on their bodies had never disappeared. But they no longer felt like wounds. They felt like proof. Proof that love had taken two broken people and built something strong enough to survive the wild frontier. Together, they watched the sun disappear behind the mountains. And in that quiet moment, the silence around them was no longer lonely. It was home.